All right, guys, for those of you who just came in, because I just started recording, we're just talking about the global market and basically 7.7 billion people expanding rapidly. It's a small world. We're going to get into importing and exporting. We're talking about just the different areas and the percentages you'll see in the PowerPoint and in the book. What percentage of population, how big Asia is, and the percentage of all the other ones as well. Resource and products. Countries with abundant resources like Venezuela, they have a lot of oil. They still need technology from other countries like Japan and, well, the US, even though there's some problems there right now. So you still have other countries that have a lot of resources, but they don't quite have the means yet. They still need technology from other countries that are good at it. Japan is a country that's very good at technology. Global trade allows countries to produce what they make best and buy what they need from others. None of us can produce everything we need. None of us can, or at least everything we want. We can probably feed ourselves, but that's about it. But there's also crops that you can't grow in certain parts of the world that you can grow in others. There's tropical crops, there's northern crops, there's all kinds of things that you want to get from other countries because you can't get them in your own country. Free trade allows this to happen. Free trade is the biggest part of this. It's a movement of goods and services among nations without any barriers. There's no political barriers. There's no economic barriers. Now, guys, as we get into this free trade conversation, I do want to throw this out there. We're talking about free trade as a market thing, as an economic thing. I don't want to get any politics about free trade. All right. I don't want that to happen. That's not what our discussion is. This is not a political class. Yes, a lot of people have some very strong opinions on free trade, but we're just talking about the basics here, just understanding exactly what it is. Speaking of that part of it, there are pros and cons to it. The global market contains, we just said, it has 7.7 billion people, potential customers for your goods or your services of your company. Productivity grows when countries produce goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage. We're going to talk about what a comparative advantage is here in a few minutes, but basically you're comparing yourselves to other countries. You can either do it better than they can or the same as they can. Global competition is a pro. It produces less costly imports. It keeps prices down. It helps us fight inflation. Free trade inspires innovation. It inspires your companies to innovate and to come up with new ideas. And the uninterrupted flow of capital, it gives countries access to foreign investments, which a lot of countries need. It helps to keep the interest rates low as well. Now we're going to get in the cons. And I want you to notice when you look at the cons, there's a theme. All right. There's definitely a theme when you look at, oh, sorry, guys, I didn't mean to do that. There is definitely a theme. Why is this not moving? There it goes. There's definitely a theme when you're looking at the cons. If we get back to that, oh, come on. Domestic workers can lose their jobs. That is one of the biggest cons when you talk about free trade. In certain sectors, depending on how the trade agreement is made, people can lose their jobs. In the United States, it happened in the 70s and 80s, it was manufacturing. It wasn't the only reason we lost manufacturing jobs, but free trade did contribute to that in the 90s as well. Workers may be forced to accept pay cuts. They may be say, they got to take a cut in pay because the company can't keep up anymore because of foreign products coming in. Companies may choose to move their operations overseas because of intense pressure from competition. This is a loss of jobs as well. And domestic companies can lose their comparative advantage when competitors build advanced production operations at low wage companies. Basically, they can produce it cheaper, the same goods you're producing cheaper. But notice the theme there. Anytime we have cons with free trade, it's always jobs. And so when our governments are talking free trade and making free trade agreements, that has to always be top of the priority list, what they're considering, what they're looking at, because all the cons have to do with losing jobs. No country wants to lose jobs. We don't want to lose jobs. Europe doesn't want to lose jobs. The countries in Asia, no one wants to lose jobs. They want to build jobs. So we're talking about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is when it's a theory that states a company should sell to other companies. A country should sell to other countries those products that it produces most efficiently, and buy from other countries those products it can't produce as effective or as efficiently. And it's pretty much the way it works, right? You're going to bring in some products that are going to compete with products you have, but most of the products you bring in are going to be stuff that it's hard to do, hard to make, or hard to get in your area. Think of produce and fruits and stuff like that. Those are very easy ones to think about. There are certain crops that only grow in certain parts of the world, and you can't get them in others. But it also falls into steel and ores and minerals and technology. Part of this leads into you can end up having an absolute advantage where a country has a monopoly on producing a specific product. Best example I could throw out here are countries that can produce good diamonds. Not many countries can produce high quality diamonds. South Africa is one that can. And I'm not saying they have a monopoly, but they do actually have an absolute advantage. When we're getting involved in free trade, we're talking about importing goods and services and exporting goods and services. Products that are widely available in one country may be unavailable in another, what we were just touching on. And that second bullet point, by working with producers in their native country, people can become major importers. So there are jobs to be made there too. Importing creates jobs, exporting creates jobs. Selling abroad may be easier to do with less competition if you have services. Exporting provides a boost to the US economy. It generates over 700,000 jobs. And exports represent 12% of the US GDP. So it is significant. Exporting does help. It does affect the economy in a positive way because companies make money. And as we talked about in the first chapter, when companies make money, that's what Adam Smith was all about. When a business makes money, it's going to expand, it's going to hire more people, and more money is going to be created into the economy. Well, importers and exporters, they're businesses just like anyone else is. They have to deal with a lot more government regulation, but we're not getting into that part. But they are basically, they are businesses. You'll hear balance of trade a lot. And when you hear us talk about balance of trade, that's when we're comparing how much we trade with another country. You always want to try to have a surplus. You're not always going to have a surplus, but you want to try to have a surplus. That's where you export more to a country, export more than you bring in, than you import. The other side of that is a deficit. You import more than you export. So that means you're really dependent on another country for something. Or if you're a small country, maybe you have a trade deficit all the time because you can't produce that many goods. I mean, it can happen naturally. US, you hear us talk about trade deficits all the time because with certain countries that have very large markets, we have a trade deficit. I mean, China is one of them. You saw how big Asia is in population. China is huge. And we have a trade deficit with China right now. Other countries we have trade surpluses with. But China is a big one, and we have a deficit with them right now. They don't look at that as favorable. You won't hear this term as often, but you will hear it, which is balance of payments. It's the same thing with some other cash flows added in. So you're still looking at the difference between the money coming into a country from exports and leaving the country in imports. You're still looking at that, but you're adding in tourism, foreign aid, military expenditures, and foreign investment. You're adding in all those things. So it throws a little more into the hopper. You're not going to see this one as often or as much, but you will see it. The goal is to have more company, of course, money coming into your country than going out. It's unfavorable if you have more money going out than coming in. There's also the issue of dumping, and dumping in the US is prohibited. It was happening in the 70s, which is part of the reason they passed the laws. It was happening in the coal industry, it was happening in the steel industry. Dumping is when a foreign country can create something at an extremely low price and they bring it in and they bring it into your country in mass quantities. This was happening with steel, and a lot of things hurt the steel industry. We could have a whole long talk about that, but dumping was part of the problem. The Japanese and the Germans were dumping steel at very cheap rates. So was Brazil. So those three countries were dumping steel at a very cheap rate into the US in the 70s, and it hurt our steel production. Laws were passed to balance it out, but a lot of the damage was done. In this map, he's basically showing you our US trading partners. Basically the largest exporting countries. I'm sorry, that's a different graph. The US is a huge exporter. The largest trading, you look at India, they're a large trading partner. You look at Canada and China and Mexico and Europe, they're both with us. They're a trading partner and they're huge exporting countries. So a lot of money flows in between Canada, the US, Mexico, Europe, India, and China, with other parts of Asia. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are thrown in there as well. But those are also very stable economies. So let's review what we're looking at so far. What are the two main arguments of favoring the expansion of U.S. business in global markets? Well, the size, guys. 7.7 billion people is too large to ignore. And it's difficult for an economy, even a large like the U.S., to produce all the goods and services its citizens desire on its own. And that's a big part of it, what its citizens desire. What comparative advantage and what are some examples of this concept at work in the United States? Comparative advantage theory, we talked about that. You should sell the things that you're good at making, that you're efficient and you're effective at. And you should buy the things that you need, that you can't produce as well or as cheap. That's comparative advantage. How's a nation's balance of trade and balance of payments determined? Well, the balance of trade is the surplus or deficit of the amount of trade we have with another country. If we export more to them and import less, it's a surplus. If we import a lot and export less, it's a deficit. Balance of payments is the same thing, but you're adding in tourism, foreign aid, military expenditures, and foreign investment and that sort of thing. Dumping is illegal, and dumping is when a country takes a very, very cheap product it can produce and basically brings it in large quantities into your market. And it might be, especially if it's a product you can produce, well, mainly if it is a product you can produce, then it's going to lead to problems. Any questions on the first part? We good? All right. It's not overly complicated. Now, strategies for reaching global market. Licensing is the least risky strategy. If you look at this, this graph and the way it's set up, yeah, the author has it going from least to most, and he has amount of commitment, control, risk, and profit potential. Licensing as a least, you're not risking much. You don't have a whole lot of profit potential, but you know what you're going to make pretty much. Your risk is low, your control is low. We're going to talk about all this, and your commitment isn't that high either. That's at the low end of this scale. We're going to talk about each one of these: licensing, exporting, franchising, contract manufacturing, joint ventures, strategic alliances, and foreign direct investment. As you go from left to right, foreign direct investment has the most potential for product, but it has the highest risk. Sound familiar? We talked about that when we talked about entrepreneurial activities in the first chapter. The entrepreneurs who take the highest risk often make the most profit. That's part of this. It's a lot of risk, but you can make a lot of money. You're going to have more, more control, and you're going to have a lot of commitment when you're on the right side of this scale. So let's talk about a few of these. Licensing. Licensing is a strategy in which a licensor, allows a foreign company, the licensee, to produce his product, and all they say is pay us a fee, right? We're going to let you produce this product. We're going to slap our name on it so you can sell it because we have a good name, and you're going to pay us a fee. It's the least risky. It's also the least amount of money you're going to make, but it's very safe, and a lot of companies do it. It can benefit a firm in two ways: gaining revenues it wouldn't have otherwise generated, and very cheaply gaining them, and spending little or no money cheaply to produce or market their products. So you're basically just giving someone else the right to do it, and you're saying you're going to pay us each month. And it's probably a set fee. It may be based off of sales. I would have it be a combination of both. Actually, if I was negotiating it, it would be a set fee, a minimum fee, with going up at a certain point if they hit a certain amount in sales. And yes, there are ways of tracking that. Exporting is the second least risky and actually second least profitable way to do global marketing. you have we talked about what exporting and importing are, but you have exporting assistance centers. These businesses help small and medium businesses. Usually they're nonprofits. There are government ones as well. They help them with direct exporting. They help them with assistance in setting up the financing, getting them the support, getting them the knowledge they need to do business with the country they want to do business with. Export trading companies, they do the same thing, but they're helping with indirect exporting. They negotiate and establish a lot of trade relationships with companies. For countries, excuse me, companies. Keep saying I'm so used to talking about companies. So basically, these exporting trading companies, what they do is they go in and they work. They kick doors open for other companies to be able to come in, and you pay them for their help. And some of them are nonprofit as well. So that's how they make their money. But exporting is the second way. The third way is franchising. Now you're getting into the middle of that graph that we were looking at. A contractual agreement whereby someone with a good idea for a business sells someone else the rights to use the name, sell the product or the service in a given territory in a specified manner. Franchising, we haven't seen, it's in our borders too. We do the same thing here. A lot of restaurants are franchises. A lot of hotels are franchises. Someone buys the rights, they get an area, and bang. But the company maintains a lot of control over the owner because you have a franchise agreement. They pretty much tell you what to do. You have very little freedom as a franchisor or a franchisee. The franchisor, who is the company, pretty much dictates you the way you're going to do things. Why do people allow this? Because guys, franchises are like, especially like in my industry, the hospitality industry, they're 90% success rate. Compared to 90% of restaurants go under in 5 years, franchises, 90% of them survive. Large and small franchisors can be successful in foreign countries. Last time I was in Spain, I was shocked at how many Starbucks I saw. I mean, it really just kind of flabbergasted me how many Starbucks I saw. It was just like, wow. Franchisors, I was kind of shocked the Spanish government allowed that, but they did. It was literally every block I turned, there was a Starbucks. Franchisors need to adapt their products to the countries they serve. We're going to get into this a little bit in the second half of the class, but franchisors, they can go into another country, but then you got to adapt to that country. We went to a McDonald's in Germany. They were serving beer. McDonald's here in the US wouldn't even think of serving beer, but in Germany, can't have any kind of food establishment without serving beer. The Germans drink beer. That's what they drink. So it was Coors Light, which was horribly depressing, but they were serving beer. Contract manufacturing, again, now you're getting into high profit, but also high risk, right? This is a foreign company's production, company's production of private label goods to which a domestic company then attaches its own brand name or trademark. Part of the broad category of outsourcing. So basically, a foreign company producing something, but someone here who has a really good name is putting their name on it. It can help companies experiment in a new market without incurring a lot of startup costs. So that's a good thing. And temporarily meet an unexpected increase in orders. So if you have an increase in orders, in a country, you're manufacturing here and shipping it, you might be able to contract manufacture there. You're contracting with some other company, bringing your people in, using their facilities, and bang, getting the product out. That happens in our borders too. I remember years ago, and yes, I'm not young, but I remember years ago, Sam Adams was making their beer in Pittsburgh. Now they were still making it in Boston, but they were gotten so big and they were trying to expand. They couldn't expand fast enough. It costs money. It takes time to build the breweries. So what were they doing? They went to the old Iron City Brew Works in Pittsburgh. That was pretty much going under. They're still around, by the way, but they're losing their market share. And they leased part of it. And they were making Sam Adams beer in Pittsburgh. It's the same idea. But it was like if Sam Adams was making their stuff in England, it would be the same thing. Contract manufacturing. Joint ventures are different, and strategic alliances. They're two very different things. A joint venture is where two companies come together, usually they'll be from different countries, and they'll do a project together. They'll put out a product together, or they'll put out a service together, right? That's a joint venture. It often mandated by countries as a condition of doing business. China does this. They'll tell you, no, you cannot come in here directly, but you can come in and partner up with one of our businesses. It can increase a company's footprint and global growth, definitely. It can be used by competing companies to join forces. Nestle, which is a European company, and Hershey, which is an American company, have done this. They have not done it here in the US, though Nestle does have a foothold in the US, not as big as Hershey does. But they have done it in Europe, where they've come together and done products over in Europe to be sold. Strategic alliance is totally a thing. This is mostly a marketing thing. This is just where a bunch of companies in an industry help each other out globally. A partnership between two or more, and it's usually more, it's usually not two, companies established to help each company build competitive marketing advantage. They don't share costs, they don't share risk or management or profits, but they share capital, they share access to market, and they share technical expertise. They do a lot of marketing together. The airlines are big into this. The Star Alliance is one. It has like American, it has Lufthansa, it has Iberia, it has, I think, British Airways and a couple others. And when you fly one, you get the benefits of all the others. And when you're booking on one site, you can book your flight for the other ones as well. Because maybe you're flying in Ireland, and there you have to fly somewhere else. You can jump on Aer Lingus and go. Or you're flying into Germany, or you're flying somewhere and you need to fly to Germany, you can fly on Lufthansa and go. So you could book it all together because they have an alliance, and you'll get your points, like your air points. Say you're with American, you'll still get your airline points, right? If you fly with one of the others. So it works out well. It's really, really marketing. It's huge marketing. And marketing is what we'll be talking about a lot today, because a lot of the global economy is marketing. Foreign direct investment is the big one. That's at the end of the scale. This is the highest risk, but also the highest profit. Buying a permanent property and business in foreign nations. A lot of companies have gotten away from this because, with your more stable governments, it's a little easier, which is one of the things you always want to assess, is how stable the government is. There's other things you want to look at, terror risks and stuff like that, but the government stability is a big one. But if you're going to, you don't want to take a risk of government changes, all of a sudden you lose all your property, or there's going to be a revolution, or there's a civil war, or, you don't want all that. A foreign subsidiary is a company owned in a foreign country by another company called a parent company. So the company's based here in the US. There's another company in Europe or in Asia or Africa or wherever it is, but the parent company is here that owns it. The primary advantage is the parent company maintains complete control over its technology and its expertise. The disadvantage is it has to commit funds and technology over foreign borders, and it may be in an area where it could be at risk of losing its technology, of losing its money and its property. Our oil companies used to have businesses in Libya. They had refineries in Libya. They had headquarters in Libya. And when Gaddafi took over in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, he threw them all out and nationalized everything. This has happened with oil in a few different countries. It usually happens when a government changes and that occurs. It's usually a very profitable business like oil, and they want those profits, they want that money, and that's why they do it. That's when you run into this. The last one under the foreign direct investment is the multinational corporation. That's an organization that manufactures and markets products in many different countries. It has multinational stock ownership. So not only does it doing business there, not only does it have buildings or factories or whatever there, it also, people in those countries own stock. There are boards of directors over there and that sort of thing. So and they also have multinational management. So you're getting in this whole giant conglomerate type of thing. Not all large businesses are multinational. Just because they're big and they're in different countries doesn't mean they're multinational. Only firms that have manufacturing capacity or some other physical presence in different nations can be called multinational. There were a time a lot of our hotel chains were multinational. Most of them have gotten away from that. Most of them don't want to own the buildings anymore. They license out. They do, actually, they're doing what are called management agreements, where you have a conglomerate over there that will own the buildings, but like Marriott or Hilton or Sheraton will put their name on it and manage it for them, but they don't own the building. They train the staff, They do everything their way, which is great because you're getting all that, but you're paying them for it. They don't want to own the building because there's tax reasons, there's risk reasons, there's all kinds of reasons. JW Marriott decided years ago to get out of that. Sovereign wealth funds are investment funds controlled by governments trying to bring foreign companies in. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. The size of the funds and government ownership makes some fear they might be used for geopolitical objectives, gaining control of natural resources, or sensitive technologies that maybe you're thinking maybe this country we shouldn't even have this inside this country because the government may come in and grab it. There is a video, but not yet. Or wait, or is there? Yes, there is a video. Hold on. That's right, I did have a video. All right. Everyone cool with that so far? Lecture so far? Any questions? It's pretty straightforward. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it operates under the auspices of the UN and a lot of other foreign governments. Their main job is to go in and do investments in areas. That was a question, guys. Okay, Moon put it to everyone. Very good. The International Monetary Fund, them and we have the World Trade Organization. We're going to talk about the World Trade Organization. I don't remember if we talked about the IMF in this chapter or not, but we talked about the World Trade Organization. The IMF helps out developing countries, helps get funding for developing countries to get them on their feet so they can compete and so they can get up to a level where they can start bringing in income and helping their citizenry, basically. All right, very good question, by the way. Any other questions? All right, let me find this video. Because of course, why would I go ahead and set it up? That doesn't make any sense. Hold on, guys. Now, what this video does is it reviews a little bit what we've already talked about. And then it also a little bit preview for what the rest of the lecture is going to be. Hold on. I almost did something bad. Forgot my 2 buttons. Got to learn the hard way, huh? All right. All right, guys, there you go.
Every day, a network of ships, trucks, and planes move massive quantities of goods around the world. Your car might come from South Korea and your t-shirt from Bangladesh. All countries export, sell products and services abroad, and import, buy goods and services from foreign trading partners. These goods are manufactured items or agricultural commodities. Services, a dynamic and growing part of trade, refer to all intangible goods such as advertising and telecommunication. But the trade network is more complex than sellers and buyers. The system of worldwide trade is an intricate web in which lengthy supply chains allow products to be sourced, assembled, packaged, and sold in different parts of the world. The materials for your phone or shoes or the tuna fish you had for lunch might have been produced in one country, processed in another country, assembled in a third country, and packaged somewhere else, all before getting to your local store. How does this make sense? Why can't countries just make their own phones, shoes, or tuna fish and provide more jobs and business domestically? Before the 19th century, most European countries tried to do just that, prioritizing self-sufficiency in a system called mercantilism. Mercantilism aimed to maximize exports, minimize imports, and increase a country's supply of gold. This system led to strict tariffs, or taxes on imports, as a way to not only discourage bringing in goods from abroad, but profit off it. Mercantilism created barriers to international trade. Countries aimed to produce as much as possible on their own, including things they weren't able to make efficiently. In the late 18th century, so-called classical economists refuted these long-held beliefs, championing the idea that societies should trade with one another to be more successful because of comparative advantage. The idea that when countries focus on making things they're comparatively good at and import the rest, everyone benefits. This is known as specialization. And when countries don't have to spend time and resources producing textiles or wine, for example, there's more room for them to innovate and create entirely new products. These classical economists argued that it was counterproductive to judge a country's power on how much gold it could amass. Today, we measure countries and economies on productivity, their ability to utilize their limited resources for maximum value. This metric is known as gross domestic product, which totals the sum of all the final goods and services a country produces in a year. Each country's human, physical, technological, and financial resources determine what that country can produce efficiently and successfully. Costa Rica excels at exporting pineapples and coffee, while Germany exports millions of cars and computers. With the acceptance of these new ideas, international trade took off. Measuring GDP instead of just gold helped boost trade and grow economies. At the same time, advances in technology and travel made remote markets much more accessible. Massive container ships, cargo planes, and cheap, instantaneous communication connected the world's producers with millions of new customers. And after World War II, the newly formed United Nations created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. This agreement substantially lowered trade barriers like tariffs and created rules to dictate how countries should trade freely. The GATT became the World Trade Organization in 1995 and tried to eliminate even more obstacles to keep up with the changing world. The WTO expanded the definition of trade to include not just goods but services, and to create rules governing intellectual property, such as copyright or a patent. The WTO is also an arena for countries to hammer out the rules and regulations of international trade and lodge complaints if they believe those rules aren't followed. According to the principle of comparative advantage, if one country can't sell a high-quality product at a reasonable price point, or new technology makes a business uncompetitive, it will not succeed. Its stores or factories might be forced to close, and jobs will be lost. That country must then adjust its economy around something it can be comparatively good at. This is the nature of international trade. However, some countries and industries are accused of skirting the rules of international trade. And that's where the WTO tries to come in. For example, in the United States, labor unions argue the WTO doesn't adequately protect U.S. wages from being undercut by unfair trade practices in China. And some developing countries say the WTO rules don't take into consideration their unique circumstances. For example, agricultural subsidies provided by wealthy governments make it hard for sellers from smaller or poorer countries to reasonably export their crops to those countries. The WTO has failed to solve these problems. They are especially hard to address because changes to the rules require consensus among the WTO's 164 member countries. Some countries forge bilateral and regional trade agreements to address their particular needs and trade strategies. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA, was designed to facilitate more trade among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA provided a blueprint for similar types of agreements between other countries. From just 1990 to 2015, world trade volume increased more than five-fold, from 3.5 trillion to 19 trillion. International trade has created a tightly interconnected world economy that's given more people than ever access to cheaper and better goods and services. It's created millions of jobs and strengthened international connections, leading to global stability. At the same time, trade can hurt those individuals, companies, and communities where imports make it impossible for local firms to compete against better or cheaper goods from somewhere else. Trade will inevitably create winners and losers, but it is inseparable from modern life. The challenge then for policymakers is to assist those who have been disadvantaged with support and the training for new jobs, so everyone can continue to benefit from the system that has given more choices to consumers and more work for producers in every corner of the world.
All right, 1 second, guys. I saw a couple of chats pop up. I can't answer those during videos because it causes a box to appear in front of the. Let's make sure we stop this in front of everyone watching the video. So let's get out of that. Let's get back into Zoom. Let me look at your chat questions real quick. Okay, just someone was late. All right. Okay, that's all. Not a problem. All right. All right, guys. So that video talked a little bit about what we already talked about. Then it started talking about other aspects of global trade that we're going to get into in the second half. In the second half of the second part of the course today, well, the rest of the course, I say second part, we're not quite halfway. But just to let you know, is a little more conceptual than what we've been going through. So that's always fun as well. All right, so it's let's stop recording. All right, so we're back. All right, guys, so a little test prep from that last lecture. The advantages, what are the advantages to a firm of using licensing as a method for global markets, and the disadvantages? Well, licensing is the least risky one, right? And so the advantages are a firm can often gain revenues and it may not have been able to generate in its home market, right? Because you're going to license out, let someone else do it over in another market. It just brings in a steady revenue stream. Licensees must purchase startup supplies and consulting services from licensing firm. So that's an advantage. And licensee and the licensors, who's the person granting the license, spend little or no money to produce their market and their products because the other company's doing it for them. So the person buying the license, the licensee, and the person granting the license, the licensor, which is basically we're just saying, here, you can use our name and our brand. It brings in a lot of money at low risk. The disadvantage is if a product is extremely successful in another market, the licensor does not receive the bulk of the revenue. So you're still just getting a steady fee. So if the other company starts making a killing, which is why I said I would negotiate where it's a steady fee unless you make above a certain sale point, and then it would be you're going to pay me extra. Because if it's just a steady fee, they can be making a killing and you're not going to get a piece of that. If the foreign licensee learns the company's technology and product secrets, it may break the agreement and begin making the product on its own. And it might be in a country that's not going to favor you in court. They might just say, no, forget it. We're not, let me get this on the bigger screen for you. No, forget it, because we're not going to screw over one of our own companies, basically, in our country. What services usually provided by an export trading company? These companies, they do all kinds of different things. They assist in associating and establishing trading relationships. They match buyers and sellers from different countries who may need each other. They help dealing with foreign custom offices. And that's a big one, a real big one, because you're dealing with the documentation, the weights and measures, all that kind of fun stuff. So they help you get through all of that. That's the main thing that those export trading companies do. What is the key difference between a joint venture and a strategic alliance? And I do want you to remember this. A joint venture, and this is important to know, a joint venture is a partnership between two or more companies whereby they undertake a major product. They're producing a product together. They're providing a service together. A strategic alliance is different. They don't share costs, risk, management, or profit. They're just doing some marketing strategies together. They may offer some similar benefits or benefits together. They may offer bonuses for using the other company. They may share, and they probably actually do share technology and share systems with each other. Like I said, with the airlines, you can basically, if you get on American and you're booking a trip to Europe, and once you're in Europe, you have to use one of the other Star Alliance airlines, you can book that all through the American online service, which is really great. American website, I should say. What makes a company a multinational corporation? A multinational corporation manufactures and markets products in many different countries, but it also has stock ownership and management in those countries. Just because you're a big company does not mean that you're a multinational. That is not the same thing. All right, before we get in the second half, we have another video. And this video is actually a great introduction to this part of the lecture, because she's Haley Edwards, she's brilliant. And it's not a long lecture, which is nice, but she's going to talk about what global trade deals really are and what they're really about. And she's going to get into some of the aspects that we already talked about. And then she's going to get into some things that we talked about in the second half. So enjoy this.
everybody. I want you all to come away from the next 10 minutes with a single counterintuitive idea. And that is that trade deals aren't really about trade. Not in any conventional sense of the word. They're not about tariffs, they're not about quotas, they're not about GDP growth, they're not even really about jobs. That's how we tend to talk about it, job loss and job gain, and that's what's in the news, and that's what's at the DNC, but that's not what they're really about. Not really. And we'll get to that. But for now, I want to start at the very beginning. The modern era of free trade, as we think of it today, started in about 1944. And when all the great lights of liberal economics got together in a little place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And at the time, the world was in a pretty dark place. It was, all the people there remembered World War I, they lived through the Depression, World War II was still raging across the Atlantic, and at the top of everyone's mind at the time was world peace. How do we create an economy that fosters and necessitates world peace? That was the entire idea. And they seized on this idea of economic interdependence. The idea was that if nation states were dependent on each other for their supply chains, then they couldn't go to war with each other. If Germany needed France for its coal and France needed Germany for its steel, then they couldn't go to war with each other. So that was the idea behind what became, about 4 years later, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this little document created the world as we know it today. It created globalization, it created outsourcing, it created multinational corporation as we think of it. It's hard to imagine a world in which there weren't, McDonald's and global corporations and the sort of structure that we have now. But the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is what did it. We created this. And it brought on this period of extraordinary disruption and convulsion and prosperity. From about 1948, when the GATT was first signed, to the late 70s, the global GDP grew by about 7% per year, just explosive growth. And for a while, people thought that wouldn't end. That was just it. We had cracked the code. But then it began to wane. In the late 70s and early 80s, you had the great lights of a new generation of liberal economics get together for a second time. A new Bretton Woods, only this time it was the Uruguay round, and it lasted for 8 years. And the scenario there was a little different. Instead of world peace and economic interdependence, they were really motivated by this idea of global efficiency. It's basically, how do we continue to boost the global economy as it has been boosted over the last 30 years? What do we do? And the scenario was different. So in the 1940s, there were just really, really high tariffs and quotas and really high or really protectionist policies at all the borders. And so lowering those could have this profound influence. But by the 80s, a lot of those quotas were pretty low. A lot of those tariffs were already pretty low. So they began to think outside the box, and they seized on this idea of non-tariff barriers. And now this leads into the modern era of trade I'm talking about now. Now, non-tariff barriers are the idea that it doesn't really matter how low a tariff is around a country's border. If once a product gets inside, it has to compete on an uneven playing field. So once you have, Jim Beam, for example, it doesn't matter if Japan doesn't have a tariff on liquor. If once it's inside Japan, it has to compete on the same shelf next to a Japanese liquor that's subsidized by the Japanese government. So the idea now was, we need to strip away all that other stuff and make the world economy as efficient as possible. And that is the philosophy that governed trade beginning in the 1990s. In 1995, we got rid of the GATT and we replaced it with something you probably have heard of, the World Trade Organization. And around that time, before and after, we had these extraordinarily, enormously powerful trade agreements, the NAFTA, the CAFTA, and literally thousands of bilateral investment treaties, all of which were governed by the same philosophy. Non-tariff barriers. How do you create or you got nation states to sign on to this idea that their domestic industrial policies, their domestic laws, their domestic regulations needed to align with this global sense of efficiency. It's the whole idea. And that, just take a moment and appreciate that, because it's totally different than anything that the granddaddies of trade would have considered trade. In the late 19th century, you know, David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all these people you learn about in the textbooks, when they were talking about trade, they were not talking about someone's domestic policy on environmental law. They were not talking about, you know, how long a pharmaceutical company's data exclusivity should last. Should it last for 12 years or 7 years or 5 years, and under what circumstances? All of a sudden, that became what we were talking about when we talked about trade. And that changed everything. So to give you two examples, one of the biggest discussions about trade that we've been having since the late 90s involves, or fights really, involves the Europeans and the Americans. And the Americans want to export their genetically modified beef to Europe, and Europe and the Europeans, for a variety of sort of cultural and social mores, don't want GMO beef. And so you have this fight, because the Europeans say that they are allowed, for local rule and national sovereignty and democratic nations reflecting the preferences of their constituencies, they should be allowed to have those rules. And the US, it's backed by the WTO, says, nope, your domestic policies are not aligning with this sense of global efficiency. And that is actually a much more interesting discussion to be having than, is trade good or is trade bad? Suddenly we're discussing national sovereignty, we're discussing local rule, we're discussing what do we mean by environmental regulations, and are we okay with them being trumped? Under what circumstances? So here's a second example, and this happened this year in the US. In the US, it used to be, or it is, that if you wanted to put your tuna on the shelf and say dolphin-free tuna on it, you had to use methods that actually excluded dolphins. And the Mexican government got wind of that and said, you know, that's not fair. That discriminates against Mexican fishermen. Because Mexican fishermen fish in waters that are dolphin heavy, and they use methods that don't exclude dolphins. So by having this law, we're actually discriminating against Mexican fishermen. And the WTO agreed. So we have, you know, these efficiency problems. You know, how do we think about global efficiency? How do we promote the free movement of as much goods and as much services across as many borders as possible, while at the same time preserving the laws and regulations that prize things that aren't about global efficiency? That are maybe about, you know, racial equality, or about protecting the environment, or laws that prize public health issues, things like that. That gets us up to where we are today. You may have noticed that the conversation that we're having about trade on the national stage right now is very confused. We've got both of our presidential candidates who appear to be in favor of free trade but are against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's that massive trade deal that would connect the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim countries. And then you have other organizations like the AARP and the Sierra Club and Doctors Without Borders that are opposed to elements of it. And people are telling us, you know, oh, you're either for free trade or you're against it, or you're for globalization or you're against it. You know, what kind of world do you want to live in? Well, we're not talking about trade. We're talking about rules. We're talking about global rules, global standards, and what kind of world we want that to be. And as soon as you sort of change your mind and you realize that that's what we're talking about, it all starts to make a lot more sense. So I want to leave you guys with that idea. We created the world that we live in now. Our forefathers got together at Bretton Woods and they created this global economy that we have now. And we remade it in the late 80s and the 90s with the World Trade Organization. The rules that we pass and that we embrace are the rules of the game that we live in. So let's think about that. Let's think about trade in that context. Let's think about what rules we want to embrace, what we want them to serve. Do we want global efficiency to be the paradigm that we think of, or do we want it to be something else, maybe like global prosperity? Global prosperity for normal people, for farmers and ranchers and everyday Americans. It's because the rules that we pass are the rules of the game, and when we talk about trade, we're talking about rules. Thank you so much.
She gives you great ideas. She gives you a great idea of what this is all about. We're talking about rules. That's what global trade is about. And the part of this she says at the end, and she's a lot of good points, and we'll actually, as we do the lecture, we'll touch back on this video a little bit. But part of what she's talking about, and I've had people say this to me, they're against global trade, right? I'm against agreements. I'm against trade. I'm against it's not a yes or no issue. The world gets smaller every day. We talked about that in the economic lecture. The world gets smaller every day. Global trade is what's making the world smaller every day. Countries do business now with each other more than they've ever done before. And that old World War II concept, during World War II and after World War II, that trade lessens the amount of violent activity, the amount, I should say, wars between countries, is actually true. Europe used to be at war all the time for centuries. There's been no major wars in Europe, I guess, well, maybe Ukraine right now, but nothing major. Skirmishes, yes, but nothing major since World War II. Long time. I mean, it works. France did need Germany. Germany did end up needing France, and you had to throw Britain in there too. Those three countries used to go to war all the time. They became dependent on each other. That stopped. Other factors were in there too, but that was a big one. Then you start talking about global efficiency, which was the focus in the 90s. And now you're in a point where we're starting to talk about, well, what about the environment? What about global prosperity? And so the whole idea of trade has changed. However, global trade, has changed. But however, what remains the same is it's a set of rules. So remember that as we're talking tonight, it's a set of rules. That's what this is. That's what global trade is. Yes, it's a great way to make money if you're in business, but it's a set of rules. So when you start talking trade, you start talking about social cultural forces. Culture, I'm sure a word you've all heard, it's a set of values, beliefs, rules, and institutions held by a specific group of people, usually within a border of a country, or several of them could be within a border of a country. Social structures, religion, manners and customs, how you treat other people, how you speak, how you act in certain ways, in certain situations, values and attitudes, language and personal communication. When you start doing business globally, you start going into other countries, you better have some people on board who have a really good idea how this works with whatever country you're getting involved with. Because business can go sour very quickly if they think you're rude or disrespectful, or you have to know your P's and Q's, as my mom used to say. Ethnocentricity can be a huge problem, an attitude that your own culture is superior to other cultures. And yes, Americans can be very guilty of it. And no, we're not the only ones who can be very guilty of it. I've met a lot of people who are guilty of it. It's easy to do, unfortunately, and it occurs fairly easily, unfortunately. But when you're doing business, it's a human thing actually, but when you're doing business, it's something you have to think about. It's something that you have to be on top of, and you have to make sure it's not occurring when you're doing business deals and dealing with other people from other cultures. Business people need to understand cultural differences, and they need to think globally. They can't think just in the way they do business in their country. I love this slide. We get into all of this when we start talking marketing, when I teach marketing. And well, I have a lot of fun with the class in it. We're not going to get too far into it here, but we start talking about global markets, you start talking about global marketing strategy and different languages and different cultures and what things mean. And these examples are great. I'm starting at lower left-hand corner. You have KFC's patented slogan, "Finger looking good." Well, in Japan, that translated, that was understood as "bite your fingers off." Not a very good marketing slogan. PepsiCo, which owns Pepsi and Pizza Hut and KFC and several others, their slogan "Come Alive" was a slogan they had for Pepsi years ago. That read in China as "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead." So again, not believable, not a very good marketing tool. Coors Beer said "Turn it loose." Well, that translation in Spanish meant "suffer from diarrhea." Not a very good way to market your product. Purdue Chicken, "It takes a strong man to make a chicken tender. It takes an aroused man to make a chicken affectionate." Woo, wow, not the marketing that you want. This is what happens when you get into other countries and you don't have someone, or outsource, hire a firm that knows how to market, how to properly translate things. Some slogans won't work. The other side of the translation glitch, Electrolux, the Scandinavian vacuum manufacturer, they dropped the slogan that they had here in the US, which "Nothing sucks like an Electrolux." Well, when something sucks in the US, it doesn't work. It's terrible. It's a piece of crap when you say something sucks. They didn't realize that because they were Swedish. So, or Scandinavian. I think they're out of Sweden, actually. You run into all kinds. There was one in Central and South America back in the 80s, I think it was, Chevy car company, Chevrolet. They were trying to market the Nova down there. Well, Nova in Spanish, that means no go. The actual name of their car was No Go. So you run into all these. I saw a funny one, actually. I was in Germany, not a funny one, but an interesting one. I was in Germany, and I was at Oktoberfest with my friends. My friends and I used to go about every other year. We would go to Oktoberfest in Munich. Big, huge festival. Yes, the beer's great. There's lots of beer. The beer's great, but it's not just the beer. The food is fantastic because you're in Bavaria. It's farm country. Everything's fresh. The German food German sausages and all that are just amazing. It's a very family thing, very community thing. There's rides, there's entertainment, there's all kinds of stuff. It's really fun. But we were in one of the beer houses. I can't remember which one. And a bunch of Italian guys were sitting across with us. And they had a picture of Peter Griffin from Family Guy, the show, American show Family Guy. And it said "Padre de la Familia," father of the family. I can't remember Italian or Spanish. I think actually it's the same in both. But I was like, "Father of the family." No, it's called Family Guy. Why they? Then it dawned on me. There's no translation, and because I know Spanish not well, but I'm pretty good at it. There's no translation for Family Guy. So they said "Padre de la Familia." It must have been the same way in Italian. So you run into that one was actually properly translated. So you run into all kinds of things like that when you start doing global marketing strategy. We'll probably touch on that a little more when we start talking about marketing and market strategy, because I did make sure that is part of this course, because I think it's important for you to come out of a Business 100 course with a fairly good idea, not just of economics and all this other stuff, but marketing. Marketing is a very strong, powerful thing for business itself. So when you're talking about global markets, economic and financial forces, exchange rate, the value of one nation's currency relative to the currency of other countries. Basically, a high value of the dollar means the dollar is trading for more foreign currency. Products are cheaper. The dollar is worth more than the currency of that country. It's cheaper. The products will be cheaper. When the dollar is what we say weak, when it has a low value, it trades for less in foreign currency. Right now, against the euro, the dollar is the $1 bill is $1.09 against the euro. The euro is $1.09, I should say, against the $1 bill. Well, what does that mean? That means if you go to Europe, your $1 bill is worth 91 cents. You have to take 9 cents off because it's $1.09. So it's worth 91 cents. So foreign goods become more expensive. Now, am I going to care about the dime? No, most people won't. But I've been to Europe when it's been $1.28 and $1.30, to the euro, and that's a problem because now your dollar's worth like 70 cents, And that's like, okay, you're not getting much for your dollar. And there was a time in England when it was worth like 50 cents. It got real bad. It's not that way anymore. It's still worth only like 75 cents in England. England runs at about buck. The pound runs at $1.25. Floating exchange rates are the currencies float float in value depending on supply and demand in the global market. So they will go up and down. The euro and the dollar go up and down. They've been pretty much even all year. I was in Mexico a few months ago, and the peso was running 20 pesos to the dollar, which gave the dollar a ton of value. $1 was 20 pesos. That was fantastic. So we had a lot of buying power, which actually happens quite a bit when you go to Mexico. I've been down there several times. Love Mexico, beautiful country. People are wonderful, and you often get a good deal, good bang for your buck, as they would say. And by the way, almost everywhere down there, not all of them, but almost every store takes American dollars because it's so strong, and they use it and they all exchange it. So it's almost like it's their currency in some ways, along with the peso. Devaluation is lowering the value of a nation's currency relative to other currencies. The U.S. had that for a long time, not so much right now. But for a long time, under Bush and under Obama, we ran with a weaker dollar to try to prop up our manufacturing. If the dollar is weaker, it's easier to sell your goods overseas. So it was trying to prop up manufacturing sales. Counter trading is a complex form of bartering. This is bartering now. This is not buying things. This is exchanging thing for thing. A complex form of bartering in which several countries may be involved, each trading goods for goods or services for services. So this is a straight barter. I'll give you 10 chickens if you give me 15 ducks, that kind of thing. Not chickens and ducks necessarily, could be, but it's usually on a much greater scale. But just to give you an idea, it's a barter. It's not a straight, it's not a transaction of money. And a lot of countries make these deals. They do flat out. They say, okay, we'll do an exchange of goods, which is great. Legal and regulatory forces you're going to run into that affect trading. First of all, and the biggest one is there's no global system of laws. And laws in different countries may be inconsistent. They may not be enforced or not enforced the way you think they would be. But there is no global system of laws for trade. There's agreements and rules, like she said in the video, but not actual laws. It's harder to take someone to court. U.S. business must follow U.S. laws while conducting global business, and this can get kind of hairy. All right. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and Transparency International fight to end corruption and bribery in foreign markets and have limited success. There are some practices that may be accepted in other countries that are not accepted in yours. Paying a bribe to someone in the government to get access to something is not something we allow in the U.S. and we look down on it. In some countries, it's just looked at as a way of doing business. It's part of the job. It's actually considered part of the compensation. You want to do business in my territory, you have to pay me a certain amount of money because I'm the person in charge of this area. And we would call that a bribe and because it's a government official. They don't consider it that way. So you run into a lot of problems with that sort of thing, and not just bribes, but with other things too. No global system of laws. Like I said, a lot of times you can get your company can get totally screwed over on a trade deal, and there's nothing you can do about it because there's really no global law that's going to protect you. Developing countries, physical and environmental forces. Developing countries have limited transportation and storage systems. That's a problem, and it makes international distribution more difficult and more impossible. Technological differences also influence the features and feasibility of exportable products. So, yes, technological differences make a problem, but infrastructure makes an even harder problem. If there's limited transportation, limited storage, and not good infrastructure, that makes a problem. This is everyone's main complaint with Ireland. Everyone loves Ireland. Ireland is a beautiful place, but driving around Ireland is a nightmare, and the Irish will even tell you that. So, quick test prep here. What are the 4 major hurdles to successful global trade? Social cultural forces we're talking about right now, and economic and financial forces, legal and regulatory forces. You're going to have different laws and different regulations in different countries. We've talked about that. And physical and environmental forces as well, which you actually touched on in the video. What does ethnocentricity mean and how can it affect global business? Ethnocentricity is when you think your culture is superior to another. And it affects global trade because all nations are proud of their culture and do not aspire to be like other countries. Just because you think you're the best doesn't mean everyone else thinks you're the best. It's a horrible way to go into any negotiation, guys. It's just being cocky. and egocentric is what it is. How would a low value of the dollar affect U.S. exports? Well, a low value of the dollar makes our exports cheaper. So it makes more foreign governments more likely to buy them and foreign companies more likely to buy them. What does the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibit? I don't know if I don't think there was a slide on this, but it's good he's here because it puts it here. So it's important. It prohibits questionable and dubious payments to foreign officials to secure business contracts. Other nations do not have to follow this law, causing disadvantages for U.S. companies. So it basically says that we can't pay foreign officials bribes. When the foreign official is used to getting a bribe, and every other country that comes in him, they just go ahead and pay him the bribe. I don't even know if I call it a bribe. It's a fee he charges for his auspices, for his granting you a certain right or certain access. And it's not frowned upon in every country, guys, but we frown upon it. We really do. And I understand why, because it leads to corruption. She touched on trade protectionism in the video. She talked about the old European mercantilism, which is they would have, and that was trade protectionism. It's exactly the same thing. The use of regulations, government regulations, to limit the import of goods and services. That's exactly what was going on in Europe for centuries. Instead of working with each other, they're trying to cut each other out. It allows domestic producers to survive, grow, and produce jobs. Yeah and no, but it keeps a lot of investment and money out of your economy by imposing tariffs. You've heard of tariffs. They were real famous during the Trump administration. Everyone was talking about tariffs. There are protective tariffs, which are taxes on imports to keep certain imports from coming into your country, and revenue tariffs, which raise money for the government. So you may come in, there may be a tariff, and actually a lot of local governments will use this if in their shipping areas. You want to come in, you're paying a fee to drop your stuff off. Where's the fee going to? It's going to the local government. At least it better be. That can lead to corruption too. But when she was talking about the European mercantilism, she's talking about trade protectionism, same thing. Import quotas are another way of having trade protectionism. All it basically is you're limiting the number of products that come into your country. You're saying to another country, you can deliver, you can sell this stuff, but only to a certain amount, and that's it, you're cut off. And they'll do that to protect their own industries and their own people. Well, at least they think they are. An embargo is a different thing. We have embargoes all the time. It's a ban on the import or export of a certain product or the stopping of all trade with a particular company. Political disagreements lead to this all the time. There are bans, there are embargoes now from Europe and the US against Russia because of the war in Ukraine. They're basically trying to punish Russia and persuade Russia to not wage the war. Doesn't seem to be working, but they're trying to use an embargo to do that. It's not all goods, but it's hurt the Russian economy quite a bit. The problem with these things, though, is a couple of things usually happen with embargoes. One is that the country will find not the entire world will embargo a country, so the country will find other countries to trade with to make up the money. So, I'm sure Putin has done that with Russia. He's just taken his oil out the back door somewhere and sold it to China or whoever else is going to buy it. So unless it's a giant embargo where a lot of countries are doing it, it doesn't work. Here in the US, we've had an embargo against Cuba for over 50 years. And Cuba is still communist and hasn't changed. And the Fidel Castro died, his brother took over. They still rule everything. It's never produced the result we wanted it to because it's only us. Cuba trades with everyone else in the world. They trade with Central and South America. They trade with Mexico. They trade with Canada. They trade with Asia. They trade with the European Union. Europeans vacation in Cuba all the time. Cuba's beautiful. I've never been there, I've been told, but it's beautiful. The Europeans go down there all the time. Non-tariff barriers are not as specific and formal, but can be just as detrimental to free trade. Non-tariff barriers are things like embargoes and that type of thing. So World Trade Organization, actually, we're not going to do the video here because we already did the video. World Trade Organization, she talked about GATT, the GATT agreement, and the World Trade Organization in the video. She gave you a really, really good assessment of what they are and why they were put together. The GATT came first, and it was replaced, and it was basically to foster world peace. The World Trade Organization had a little broader. It was for world peace too, but had a little broader purpose as well, to oversee practices and all this side of thing, and to basically go after global efficiency, make the trade more efficient, more beneficial to each country. So again, those were in the video. She did a great job of going over those. Common markets, a regional group of countries that have common external tariff, no internal tariffs, a coordination of laws so they can exchange easily. It's also called a trading bloc. The most famous one now is the European Union. The European Union is wide open, which is just amazing because these countries for centuries were busy killing each other. And now Germany and France that went to war twice in the early 1900s, World War I and World War II, they went to war twice. Now they have an open border. 100 years later, less than 100 years from World War II, they have an open border. It's amazing. You can drive all around Europe and you don't have to stop and get your passport stamped. You only get your passport stamped when you go into Europe and when you leave Europe. Once you're in, not Britain anymore, but Ireland and Belgium and France and Austria and Spain and Portugal and Italy, and it goes on and on and on, Greece, and you can just travel around. And they all exchange goods with each other and they all exchange services, and they are now the strongest economy in the world. It's amazing. He gives you some examples of some other ones. There's a bunch of them. Great, the dog is barking. All right, not a big deal. He barks. He doesn't bark a lot. He's a Wheaten Terrier. They don't bark a lot, thank God. And he gives you a picture of the EU here. And what he has is the countries that are members, and we're not going to read them off. There's no reason to. Non-members, and ones that have applied. And now this is also older. United Kingdom, okay, it's just very recent. Good. They exited the European Union. That's why they're in blue. Brexit. We're not going to talk about Brexit, but we're not going to get into that one. We could talk all night. All right, we have a question here. I am late again. No, that's not it. No, that was just an accident. All right, no chat question. So, and then you see some of the countries that have applied. Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina applied. Yet Croatia and Slovenia are already in. Switzerland, or no, green is non-members. I'm sorry, they're non-members. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Switzerland. I didn't think Switzerland was a member. They're not. They're right in the middle, and they're not a member. Turkey applied years ago, has not gotten in. Kosovo, Macedonia, and a few others, Albania, have applied, have not gotten in. The Europeans have they're a little worried about the economics of letting those countries in. I think they will eventually get in, though. Not 100% sure about Turkey, but I think the other ones will get in. I don't think the Swiss will ever get in. The Swiss have their own banking, their own economy, and their own thing going on, and they don't want to share anything with anyone. So you've heard of Swiss banks? That's true. A lot of people use Swiss banks for certain reasons. Here on our continent, we had NAFTA, the Northern American Free Trade Agreement. That was created in 1993 between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And it allowed for job growth. It fought poverty. It increased the trade between the three countries. There were certain parts of the U.S. where the citizens were against it. Basically, where I grew up, even though I was a fan of it, but people are like, oh, it's going to hurt the steel industry because you're getting all this cheap steel from Mexico. Mexico did not hurt the steel industry. A lot of things hurt the steel industry. We can talk about that for 2 hours too, but it wasn't Mexico. And it helped the Mexican, it helped the Mexican economy a lot because it really opened up the trade between the U.S. and Canada with them, and it really helped. It's since been replaced. They were in the process of replacing anyway, and then it was replaced under Trump. They were actually, it's more of a revamp than a replacement, but it is a new agreement. It's the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And it's a little improved rules, a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's an open trade agreement. In Central America, they have the Central American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA. It's created a free trade zone with Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, all the ones in the middle, Nicaragua, all the ones in the Central American countries. So when we talk about protectionism, what are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantages are minimum. Trade protectionism is the use of the government's regulations to limit the import of goods and services, but it can be a barrier to global trade. It is a barrier to global trade. You're never going to make as much money with protectionism as you're going to make with global trade. What's the purpose of the World Trade Organization? It was established to mediate trade disputes among nations, but it does more than that. It builds trades. It sets rules for trade. Remember, we talked about this. Global trade is about rules, not just about trading. It's about the rules that are set about trading. What is the key objective of a common market like the European Union? Have stronger economies. No internal tariffs, laws that coordinate with each other, make it easier to exchange between nations. All right, what time is it? It's 8:10. It is 8:10. Let's still stick with the 15-minute break. Let's come back at 8:25. All right. I will see you guys at 8:25. All right, guys, let's get back at it. Okay. 1 second, guys. Taking care of something on chat real quick. All right, there you go. All right, guys, let's get back at it. Global trade, here we come. All right, so what is the future of all this? Well, with over 1.4 billion people, China is the world's largest exporter. It has the second largest economy. So they're going to be a big part of global trade for years to come. With over 1.3 billion people, India is going to be huge. It's growing. They have a great technology industry in India. They're great at pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. They're going to be a big player in global trade. Russia's economy has slowed, to say the least. That war they're carrying on is just killing it. And it's also played with, it's got a lot of corruption, political problems, social problems. I mean, there's just a lot going on there that's not good, unfortunately. And Brazil is expected to dominate the world market in raw materials in the next few years. So, I mean, there's a lot going on in global trade. The U.S. economy, even when it's weak, it's strong. Even when we consider it bad, it's still good compared to most economies. Europe has kind of gotten the same way. We were both hit hard by COVID, but we both came out strong, or at least are coming out strong from COVID. Yes, I know we have inflation. Inflation is starting to come down. It's going to continue to come down, in my opinion. Remember, it's economics. Everyone has an opinion. Offshore outsourcing is a big challenge in global trade. It will continue to be. It's a process whereby one firm contracts with other companies to do some and all of its functions. They do this to save money. They do this so they don't have to develop a department. Things like payroll and accounting and even manufacturing for years have done this, right? They'll have their books done by some company overseas. They'll have their call center run by some company overseas. With global markets growing, companies have begun shifting to offshore outsourcing with other countries. This is really happening. And I know it's been around for a while, but it's getting bigger. And there are some quality issues. You run into cultural differences, especially when you start running into things like customer service. You run into quality differences. In terms of quality, remember, quality is something that's perceived, right? Through our own lenses, our own paradigms. But quality issues, as in communication is going to be hard. And not just verbal, but in body language as well. If you're doing like a video thing and that type of thing, so it can be challenging. Let me put it that way. It can be challenging. The pros: less strategic tasks to be outsourced globally, so that companies can focus on their things. If they outsource some of this stuff, they can focus on what they do best. The outsourced work allows companies to create efficiencies. Again, kind of the same thing. That in fact let them hire more workers so they can grow because they can focus on what they do. Consumers benefit from lower prices generated by the effective use of global resources. Remember global efficiency she talked about in the video? That type of thing. The cons? Well, look, here we go again. Jobs may be lost permanently and wages may fall due to low-cost competition from offshore. That can easily happen. Offshore outsourcing may reduce product quality and can therefore cause permanent damage to a company's reputation. Communication among company members with suppliers and with customers can become more difficult because you're probably going to have language barriers and you're going to run into there, just cultural barriers as well. And those are always challenges. And I think as time goes on, there'll be less challenges, but they're challenges right now. Globalization in your future, study foreign languages. I highly recommend learning another language. I'm still working on Spanish. I've gotten better at it. Am I good? No, but I can kind of communicate, and it expands your mind, which is what I love about learning another language. Learn about foreign cultures, travel. I love traveling. Go see, especially with Europe, it's easy because you can see so many cultures in such a limited amount of space. It's really neat. And take global business courses for global perspective, not just Business 100, but other global business courses. Globalization is a real thing, guys, and economic competition promises it to intensify. The world gets smaller every day. It gets smaller every day, economically, globally, and people are people, man. And we all want to live good lives. Small, medium, large businesses have global market potential. Absolutely. Excuse me, losing the voice a little bit. Absolutely. With the internet now, you don't have to be big to be global. Some of the major threats to doing business in global markets, unstable governments is the biggest one. And actually the author did not have that listed. I put that in there. I mean, you got to have that. Terrorism, nuclear proliferation. Yeah, that would be a bad one. Rogue states and other issues, which I guess he meant by unstable governments. Unstable governments is one of the biggest fears that you have to have. What key challenges must China's face before becoming a major global economic leader? Well, there are concerns about China's one-party political system, human rights abuses. They tend to control their currency a little too much. For years they had it pegged to the U.S. dollar, the yuan. I don't think it is anymore, but it was for years. And they have a huge urban population that continues to grow. They also have an underground economy, which allows for piracy and counterfeiting. And it's something you constantly have to be concerned with when you're dealing with China, is piracy and counterfeiting. What are the two primary concerns associated with offshore outsourcing? Well, first is loss of jobs. We've been talking about that every time we bring it up. Anytime you're outsourcing something, or you talk about global trade, you have to think about jobs. The second is safety. Outsourcing of sensitive products like airline maintenance or medical devices. Do you really want? Another country may not have the same standards on that type of stuff that you have. And consumers' fear about quality and product safety keep the issue at center stage. Your consumer may not be comfortable with a certain product coming from a certain area. Stop sharing here. Okay, so